everyone. Welcome to our next panel. And our next panel, who are now joining me now, is our next generation panel. So the premise here is that we are making decisions now on infrastructure investments that will determine transport for decades to come. So what does the next generation want and expect from the transport system they're going to inherit? Are we heading towards a transport system that is consistent with their anticipated needs and values? And how might the sector prepare itself to deliver what will be needed? So on the stage with me now is Farah Naim from Costain, who's representing British Aviation Group, Victoria Lindsay from Story Contracting, representing the Rail Industry Association, and Yara Al Hamdan from Atkins, representing Chartered Institute of Highways and Transportation. Let's make them feel really welcome. To start off with, will you just introduce yourselves to our audience and briefly tell us your transport-related professional background? Just give us a brief idea of what you're all about.
Yep, so I'm Victoria. I work for Story Contracting and we're on the kind of contracting side. Our main client is Network Rail. My personal background's engineering, so I've come from the engineering side of things. And now I work on the decarbonisation programme from Aberdeen to Central Belt and a lot of the rail enhancement frameworks up in Scotland, if you could tell by the accent. So yeah, that's kind of my background.
Perfect, thank you.
I might need the mic.
Oh, do you need the mic?
Yeah.
There we are, my love. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Yara Al Hamdan, transport planner at Atkins. Around 4 years of experience in active travel schemes, parking strategies, traffic impact studies, and I'm also on the National Council for CIHT. Used to work in Dubai as well, so got a little bit of experience in the Middle East. So yeah, that's me.
Perfect. Thank you.
Hi guys, my name is Farah Naim. I work for the same integrated transport team. I'm one of our aviation consultants, and I also chair British Aviation Next Generation Group, which looks at fostering community for the next generation of aviation professionals. And a lot of my work at the moment is really around hydrogen and sustainable flight.
Thank you. Actually, you can have a microphone each, because I just spotted there's one there for you. So I'm quite curious, actually, about how you use transport for work and leisure, and how some of your peers use it as well. It makes me feel so old. You really do. So how do you use it?
So me personally, I stay in quite a rural area, so unfortunately I'm one of these ones that has to use my car quite regularly, especially with my job in the contracting sector. It's a lot of sites to visit, a lot of area to cover, so I do use my car quite frequently, but then probably from more of a leisure point of view, I would use your kind of railway networks, buses, that kind of thing. Usually when I've got time and reliability doesn't matter as much, that's probably how I would use it most.
Do you wish that you didn't have to, so are you mainly using your car then? Do you wish that you didn't have to rely on your car so much?
Yeah, I do, and it's one of those, it is purely the reliability side of things, you know, to get to work, to know I can go to various sites and I'm in control of that. Obviously you do have traffic and things as well, but you can leave earlier, but unfortunately just probably where I stay as well, it is quite limited for regular transport, and it is that reliability, especially getting home at night. I wouldn't like to think if I miss my train, how am I getting back, you know, or if it's quite long journeys. So definitely reliability is one of those ones that's holding me back personally from using it in my day-to-day.
Can I throw it out to you two as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I kind of gone from working predominantly in offices and like taking my car everywhere to now working from home a lot more. So really it's kind of changed my thinking process around, is travelling, is this trip worth my effort, is it worth my time, is it worth my cost? And I think for leisure it's mostly largely around using public transport, and I think for me Crossrail's made that a lot easier, just in terms of I live in a well-connected area, however the end-to-end journey is a bit more difficult, so Crossrail kind of helps that sense because I don't have to keep changing Paddington, and that's just cumbersome for me, so it's kind of helped make that journey a bit more pleasant and less stressful.
For me, for commuting, I use the bus to commute to work. As a part of our Bristol office travel plan measures, we have basically a free bus that's available to Atkins employees, so that's really convenient for me. As for leisure and other trips, also bus. So so I use the bus and public transport network within Bristol, and I've got my rail card so for trips outside of Bristol.
That's a choice. Is it because the public transport system there is particularly good? What's your thinking behind that?
No, it's still not really that reliable. I would say if my working hours weren't flexible, then I wouldn't be able to do that. But since my working hours are flexible and I can choose the days where I'm going to the office, say for example the bus is really late or just doesn't show up, which happens sometimes, then I can just decide I'm going to go into the office another day. So I feel like that flexibility has made it easier for me.
I'm going to throw this out to all of you. To what extent do you and your peers, how concerned are they about CO2 emissions, climate change, all of those things? And to what extent does that influence the way you travel and the amount that you travel?
I think it's an interesting question. I think for everybody here, obviously, it's top of mind, isn't it? You know, we all work in this industry, it's super important to us. But when I talk to other friends that work in finance or they work in pharmaceuticals, it's not quite so top of mind. I think for them it really comes down to time and affordability. And I think one thing that's been touched on plenty of times throughout this conference is that it's not so affordable travelling by train, for example, versus your car. So I think for people in our generation, it's really about how do you make that switch and make it painless for people such that they're not actively thinking, it's going to cost me more, but I'll be more sustainable. How do we create that switch for people such that they can be and they can afford to be?
And what thoughts have you had, all three of you, on how that switch can be made? What needs to be done, would you say?
I'd say probably some kind of either incentives or constraints. I think that's really what, I always think that issues, unless they directly affect you, you're kind of naive to it. So if it's not at the forefront of your everyday, it's easy to be like, oh, it's not my problem, someone else will worry about that. But I think if it was almost then put on you that either you can get rewarded for doing that or changing, or you're going to get penalised in some kind of way, then you would actively do something different. So that, for me, I think that's what you would need, is either some kind of incentive or a constraint, which is not what you want, but I think earlier was mentioned about, tolls and, different taxes, that kind of thing would probably push you that direction as well.
So you're quite hardcore then? Or is it hardcore? I don't know. Maybe it's not hardcore at all, is it? To say, okay, we want more taxes, we want more this, we want more punishment.
Maybe more
punish
the incentive side would be better. I'd probably prefer that,
But do you think it's the only way, essentially? Because, we are facing a climate emergency, aren't we?
Yeah, I think it's awareness, isn't it? It's people's attitudes. It's, making people talk about it, having those discussions, openly speaking as well. I think a lot of times people will shy away from the harder conversations or putting themselves out there and their opinions out there. And that's probably what we need, is more people, like more conferences like this, to bring it to people's forefront and know that that's the issue, and also tell us what we can do. How can you help? What's the easiest ways of helping? Yeah.
So I kind of agree with that. I also think there's a kind of a carrot approach in terms of making it more visible to people. So for example, how you get an option to see, how much carbon I saved on this journey. Are we not doing that in all of our apps? We all typically use a certain app for train travel, for flight. Are we not showing that more and more? And then people can feel more incentivized in that sense to show, actually, I've saved X amount of carbon. So we're trying to change behaviours positively, and also being transparent, I guess, around providing people visibility around their end-to-end journeys, I think would be helpful, just in terms of to help people plan. I know for me that when it comes to planning, I do think the time it takes from the trains versus the car, and that end-to-end journey, creating kind of a seamless travel would be great in terms of making it a quicker, better journey for me.
Don't forget, we'd love to have your questions to our panel. So the hashtag that you need to use is #interchange. So do send in your questions. We'll pick them up on Slido. Did you want to pick up on what has just been said?
Yeah, definitely. It's about providing the capability, the opportunity, the motivation for people to influence them to have a behavior change, or to influence them to take more sustainable modes of transport. If you don't make them more competitive in terms of the price, the convenience, and the reliability, then people won't have that incentive for behavior change.
Speaking of behavioural change, has the way that you've used transport changed since COVID, would you say?
Yeah, I think, as you mentioned previously about working from home, that flexibility is, me personally, I'll maybe do 3 days out of the house travelling, and then you've got 2 days at home. So again, there's maybe slightly less demand, but if your job was every day to be there at a certain time, you would need that reliability and consistency. But I think there's probably that working from home, the balance, the flexibility that's had an impact.
Yeah, it's what I mentioned about the flexibility, because I use the buses a lot, and they can be very unreliable sometimes, and because I have that flexibility, I don't have to think, oh, the bus is so unreliable, maybe I should get a car, or the bus is so unreliable, I should get an Uber. I could just walk back home, do my work from home, and say, hey, I'll go into the office another day. And that type of flexibility, I think, really gives me that opportunity to be able to use the mode of transport that I want to choose.
Has technology helped? Did you say you live in Bristol?
Yeah.
Because here in the West Midlands, well, I can speak about Birmingham because I don't have a car myself, and I use buses, I use trains, and what have you. I don't know what you call it, but you have the digital display on the bus shelters. Do they have that there? Does that not work? Is
Yeah.
that not reliable?
Yeah, definitely, and as well as the live information on the first bus or whatever bus application you use, just for me to be able to see, is this bus actually coming? When is it going to be here? Is it going to be late? That will help me, decide early on if I'm going to make my journey to the office. Yeah.
What about things like holidays? I don't know whether you do long haul, short haul flights. Thinking about the climate emergency, has that changed the way you might be flying or taking planes and that type of thing?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's changed how many holidays I take or how many flights I take. However, it did change my outlook towards that, and maybe I take smaller steps to reduce my carbon footprint, trying where possible to book direct flights, as well as packing as light as I can to reduce my CO2 footprint. It doesn't change how frequently I travel, but I guess small changes that I make to be conscious of it, I guess.
Does anybody else want to add to that at all?
No, I don't think it's changed the way in which I kind of fly for leisure. I think it's changed the way in which I travel for business. So when it comes to, what are the other options I can choose that might take me a little bit longer, and I've chosen those over taking my car because I know that it's much more of a sustainable choice. And I think that filters down to, us trying to create those incentives, be it through our business, through our clients, and trying to drive that behaviour through to people.
Okay.
Yeah,
Victoria,
I
did
would
you want to add to
agree.
that?
I would say from a business point of view, you've maybe got a slightly different attitude of if it takes longer but it's better, we can do that. And also if you're being reimbursed, I think probably the price factor comes in when it's personal. You probably want to use the cheapest way to go on your holiday and use more money elsewhere. That is a driver. So kind of what you said as well before, unless it's more competitive, price-wise, it's hard to make those choices, I would say.
Okay. I'm quite curious about something that's had an impact on how you travel. So, Farah, you mentioned Crossrail, so that's changed. So tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well for me, often before Crossrail, it's always a case of having to go from my house to the train station to Paddington, to then go to get the tube, to then go to the next station. And that's quite a long journey. It's quite a lot of pressure on that one point, and it adds a little bit of stress to the journey. Since Crossrail comes in, it's a lot easier for me to go directly from my house to the train station to then actually getting into the underground. So it just kind of takes a little bit of pressure off that journey. It kind of helps with respect to when you get to your final destination. So a little bit less stress, and you can use your time in a much more effective way, because I know that journey might be slightly longer, but I could do work on that journey. I could listen to a podcast. It's about that effective use of time and me choosing that as opposed to me having to take a different route because there's no alternative.
Interesting.
I'd say something that really impact how I travel is what I mentioned about the office travel plan. It's a convenient, affordable, actually not free service that takes me, picks me up about 7 minutes away from my house and takes me straight to the office. I'd say that, along with limited number of parking at the office, has encouraged a lot of people that work at the Atkins Bristol office to take this service or to use other sustainable modes such as active travel modes. So that's definitely been a huge factor.
Cost is a huge factor, isn't it? I mean, when you compare rail prices on the continental Europe, do you think more needs to be done to try and bring down those prices?
Yeah, cost, well, not just cost, but also cost and accessibility to people that are from lower income backgrounds as well. So public transport can be quite inaccessible in certain communities that can be marginalized. So definitely bringing down the cost and making it more accessible to everyone.
Okay. Victoria, we're talking about one thing that's had an impact on how you travel. Can you give any examples?
I think just general awareness. It's how busy things are as well. It's time, it's reliability, as I kind of mentioned, and cost. And it's as well that kind of, not the station to station part, or, it's to your door part, it's that final step. And like I say, I live in quite a rural area, so even if I did take the train, it's that final bit, and it's the kind of safety aspect and things as well. So there is loads to consider there, but definitely the flexibility at work makes me more conscious of, I'll try not to drive as much. And again, if I've got more time, I could do public transport to get there, and I can kind of factor that in.
Can you say what, the good things about the transport system as it is? I know we're trying to move towards an integrated system. What's good about it right now, would you say?
So it kind of goes back to when I said earlier a little bit around planning. So I quite like to plan my journeys. So the fact that I can kind of use one app to then see from my door to the end point, I think that's helpful. I think in terms of understanding, okay, well, these are the different multimodal forms of transport I can use, and seeing them all in one go as opposed to me having to use different apps is inconvenient. So that's helpful. I think there's more to be done to improve that, such that you can use that platform to then, purchase, change, see all the real-time updates. That would be great from one point of view. But I think that's quite a nice improvement that I've seen in the last couple of years.
Yeah, like e-tickets and things as well. That's all very convenient, a lot easier. Yeah, I would agree. It's like the accessibility. And the fact that there is transport there as well. There is a lot of stations, and we're going that way of creating more, so it can only get better, but it is a good setup as it is.
What improvements then do you think need to be made? What are the key things in your mind you think, right, I just wish X would be improved because that would make life so much easier for people? And what do planners need to think about going forward, do you think?
I think one main thing is making it more inclusive. Like when it comes to the rail network, it's quite efficient, it's fast, it takes you to the center of the city that you want to travel. And it's a great way to travel, but then it's really, a lot of stations really exclude people with disabilities, for example, especially if you have to take stairs between platforms and there's no other alternative way, which happens at a lot of the stations, especially the rural ones. So definitely just improving inclusivity and affordability, of course. Yeah.
We've been thinking about all the way through this conference, of course, moving towards net zero. Transport, as I'm sure you know, is the biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Are we going fast enough to decarbonise transport in your view? Victoria?
So I've got a bit of a slightly different view from that, being on the contracting side of things. So we're physically trying to help the infrastructure to allow things to be decarbonised up in Scotland. So, bridges need to be raised, we need to increase, gauge for the freight trains also, and, allow these things to happen, but we're constantly kind of getting pulled back with government funding and the other constraints and, like public council areas. So it's one of those, my company in particular, we're really pushing to try and get that done, and we've got our targets for each year, how many structures we need to have done, but we have a lot of those other factors which are also encouraging us, but they're also holding us back. So it's one of those, it feels like we have it set out as there's targets and there's plans. It's just what happens then if we miss those targets or we don't, is that kind of is there enough of an incentive to do it, I would say, maybe from my point of view being in that.
Tell us more about some of these constraints then, because it looks like you're trying to push forward, but you're being held back. And we've got to get to net zero by 2030.
Yeah.
Am I right, 2030 or 2050? It's a path, it's 2050, isn't it? 2050, I beg your pardon. So that must be incredibly frustrating and worrying.
Yeah, it's difficult because, we're constantly trying to push for this, because obviously financially for my company, it's a gain to be able to do these structures. We'll get paid for that, that's great. So we've got the incentive to go for it. But I think, again, it kind of comes to that attitude thing. You're dealing with a lot of landowners, council areas, and trying to get everyone on board is quite difficult. And we then have to do quite big payouts to enable these. And that's when the conversation when it comes to money, it gets a little bit difficult, because yes, everyone wants that, but how much is it going to cost? And, I've actually seen it where some projects get pushed aside because they're going to be really expensive to try and get those going forward. And it's like, we'll deal with that in 2 years' time, So I am seeing that the easier ones are coming first, and we'll see how that goes. And hopefully, as the pressure continues, we can get past these conversations and more will happen. But yeah, it is quite difficult at the minute when you're trying your best to go towards something and you're getting blockers along the way. And unfortunately, it's the financial blockers that seem to be the biggest ones.
So what needs to be done then?
I think I would agree with that completely. There are financial blockers there are incentivisations. Like, for example, if you're looking at hydrogen and the fact that we're trying to stimulate a brand new market, and you need those kind of hydrogen business models, you need to understand the market you're playing in, the supply and demand. It's about how can government help support that, how can regulation help support that, and these are some of the things that whilst businesses and industry are pushing for, you still need that government support to move forward. And I think until you do that, it's kind of very chicken and egg. You don't quite know which one to go with first or how to kind of create that market without knowing the demand.
Farah?
Yeah, in order to reach net zero economy by 2050, surface transport emissions need to be reduced greatly, by 63% in 2035, which is quite a big target. And right now, as transport planners, what we all do is small pockets of incremental change and small pockets of interventions in different places, and it's just not applied at a large enough scale, which is why I guess there's an urgency now for interventions that we know work and that we know reduce carbon emissions. There's an urgency for them to be scaled up and applied at a wider scale.
But we heard this morning from Sir John Armitt, the way to move forward is by building more roads. It's kind of, what I'm hearing is kind of problematic, isn't it?
I guess so. I think it's, you need the infrastructure there to encourage people to use it. If there's not enough there and it's difficult, then why would you make those choices? You would stick to what's easy and convenient and reliable. So there probably does need to be more options. I don't know about the road side of things, but maybe that is one way of doing that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that is one opinion, one way to look at it. But I would say another way is also to just look at the interventions that we already see work in certain areas and see what works in rural areas, what works in big cities, what are the interventions and the policies that we know have been proven in our projects, and we have the data and we can see that they have proven reductions in CO2 emissions. And how can we take those interventions and policies and then apply them in similar locations where we know that we've seen that this worked here, we can sort of scale it up and apply it elsewhere.
Okay. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I agree with that. And just the case of it's kind of like taking that best practice approach really, and understanding what other industries are doing, how they're working there, how other regions. So if you look at clusters, industrial clusters, and how they're working there, how are we using existing infrastructure as opposed to building more roads.
Okay, interesting. Now we have a gloriously all-female panel this afternoon. So if you were in charge, what would you do to make things better?
So it's going to go back to inclusive design for me in terms of understanding all the different types of people. So rather than modelling the transportation system on the average user, we need to be modelling it based on all of the outcomes that we want to achieve. Somebody had mentioned that last mile element in terms of it being a female. Do I really want to be on the train at 11 p.m? Do I feel safe? And if I don't, what's embedded into design to make me feel safe? When I'm thinking about people with families, when I think about young mothers, if they want to use a train, they want to breastfeed, is that comfortable for them? Are they able to? Is there space for them? Thinking about different types of people that are going to be using that, and therefore modelling that needs to be embedded within our design, and it needs to be kind of front of mind for it to be a 2050 kind of transportation system that works for us all.
Farah?
Yeah, I think a lot of times, especially in transport planning, we find that the people making the decisions sometimes are not the people that have the most to gain or to lose from these decisions, not just in terms of women, but I'm talking about inclusivity in the transport sector for everyone, disabled people, and also regardless of age or gender, everyone should be considered for it to be a truly inclusive transport system. Things that I've seen, I've been going around a bit around the country and doing more around the southwest and auditing some stations for accessibility for disabled people. And some of the things are just, there's sometimes like literally a ramp that just goes straight onto the tracks. And if you're in a wheelchair,
Yes. Yeah.
and also we don't think about how people can literally choose to drive just because there's no accessible restrooms at certain stations that are on their journey. So we really need to think about those small details. What is it that's preventing people from having that motivation to choose a more sustainable form of travel?
Yeah, and I would agree, and I would say more from probably not so much, I know we spoke about, the kind of older male generation making the decisions and the lack of potentially females, but I think it's also an age thing. It's a lack of maybe young people and you know, a fresh perspective, because I always think, you know, when people are successful in their careers, they go through the stage of being nice and fresh, then you get pressures of the business and your peers and constraints, so you kind of get clouded by those kind of exciting ideas, and then, you know, the people at the top, they maybe don't have that. So I think maybe just including young people, and one of the things in my company that we do is our executive leadership team, they do shadow mentoring, so they have someone that's in their early careers, maybe first or second year, speaking to them about, you know, the big executive discussions that they have, and just giving a different perspective, and it's mutually beneficial because you're getting mentoring, you're getting the experience, but you're getting a fresh set of eyes and the future generation, what they want, and taking those opinions in, and that's who you're doing this for. So I think just including young people in those discussions, let them have a say, and I think as well, the more you give people responsibility, the more ownership they'll take and drive with it, you know.
Absolutely, no, I
So
agree.
yeah, a bit
Absolutely.
more
I want to
inclusive.
round off by looking to the future. You would imagine it's 2050. So what do you hope to see from this fantastic transport system that we are now going to be building?
Affordable would be one.
Yeah.
I'd say something that's very, you know, currently it is obviously underpinned by digital, but more so even you know, having that access, but also making sure that's accessible for people who are elderly as well. So whilst I might love having everything done via an app or, you know, via a fingerprint, my mum might not. So it's about understanding that. But I'd say, yeah, that kind of affordability, that inclusivity, and that kind of digital kind of ease of use as well.
Yeah, I mean, she's mentioned affordability and inclusivity. Maybe I'll add to that a safer transport network, which could be helped by perhaps driverless cars and other things that we'll see in the future that will facilitate that.
And I would just say reliability, that you can depend on your transport, and the cost side as well, that it's affordable, it's something you can factor into your everyday, whether it's your company funds it or if it's self-funded, just to allow everyone access to that.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for, you know, sharing your views with us this afternoon. It's been really insightful to hear your perspective on what we ought to be building for the future. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give them a really warm round of applause.